Hello and welcome to Diversity in Research. My name is Lachlan Smith.
And I'm Jakob Felfors Christensen. Today we are talking to Kamil Karczweski from the European University Institute in Florence, where he is a historian. And we invited Kamil on the podcast, and this is a bit of a long story perhaps, but he's a historian and he's written about queer history in Poland, particularly in the interwar period. And we invited him to talk about that in order to give us an update on how if we look at LGBTQ plus rights in Central and Eastern Europe, that the history is a bit more complicated than we perhaps think in the current political environment. And we wanted to talk a bit about that as a way to open the discussion about how FP10, the next European framework program for research that'll be after Horizon Europe, how that is going to look when it comes to diversity and internationalization, because a lot is going on, and the European Commission has just announced that they are now accepting ideas, and we'll see a lot of position papers on this and that in the coming month, and the work will really start after the elections for the European Parliament in June, and after that we will also see a new European Commission, and that's when the work will really start. Our thought is, who is going to lobby for diversity and internationalization? How is it going to look? Who's going to promote it? And how far can we take it? Because at the end of the day, this has to be accepted by the member states. So we took a dive back into the interwar period in Poland to talk about how queer life looked back then, and I think a lot of you will be surprised about what you're going to hear. And we use that to take it up to today, look at the current political environment, and talk about how we can use this knowledge as we move forward. We had a wonderful time. Kamil is a brilliant researcher and done some really interesting work, and I hope you'll all enjoy the history part as much as the political conversations that we invited him to speculate on with us in this interview. So, without further ado, here is Kamil, our conversation with Kamil, and then we'll be back with some thoughts afterwards. And so we are now joined by Kamil. Kamil, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, hello.
And before we dive into today's topic, could you just tell us a bit about yourself and your research?
I had the feeling that you were scared by my surname. Rightly so.
Yeah, exactly. But we always tend to present people by the first name when in the introduction we do before, and then just to go directly to first names when we get here. But yes. My guess would be something like Karczweski, but I'm not.
Spelling is always a problem, but I'm Kamil Karczweski. I'm a historian. I research queer history of Poland, Eastern Europe. Currently, I work at the Institute of Historical Research. I'm past and present fellow there. It's part of the University of London. Mm-hmm. And I got my PhD at the European University Institute. I'm sorry, this is always confusing because in every language, the three words are differently placed.
Yeah.
In Florence.
And we wanted you here today on the podcast for several reasons. I've followed you on Twitter for a while now, and but one of the reasons here is to help us and the listeners gain a deeper understanding of LGBTQ plus rights in Central and Eastern Europe, and that's not to say that things aren't bad in many of these countries. They definitely are, but it's also one of your points has been in your has been that it's a bit more complicated than that, and that is of course a key point in this podcast and our work in general as well. So can you tell us a bit about the research you have done on LGBTQ plus rights and the lives of LGBTQ plus persons in Poland in the interwar period, because it's really fascinating in itself, but you also tie it to the situation today, which we can go into afterwards.
Of course, I'm a historian, and usually when we talk about these issues in Central and Eastern Europe, we tend to look, I believe, in quite a historical way as something very contemporary, especially when we talk about rights. And the issue of rights or public discussion is a very contemporary phenomenon. But part of my work, or my very important focus on my work, is showing the history, a very long, very sometimes history of these communities, and also the concept of rights, that they are not so new. And I think this is something that gets overlooked, and it is exploited politically by homophobic subjects, let's say, or parties. But we will probably discuss it later. When I was starting my research, which was, I think, 2015-16, I considered doing my PhD in Poland. And then at one of the main universities in the country, I was told that there was no political atmosphere or environment for such research. And importantly, I don't think the person who told me that was doing it for homophobic reasons. I think it was he was actually a well-wisher. Just informed me, like, you will get nowhere here. And what he meant was obviously funding to make many years of research that nobody has done before. Really required a lot of time, effort, and which means that I had to focus only on that. I couldn't have a job aside, right? So that's one thing. And the other thing that he told me, he said that I don't think there are sources. He told me, I think there are no sources to sustain research of this kind. So, however, interestingly, he added then something like, but women historians were also told, historians of gender were also told that before, and then they came up with so many sources. So we can give it a try. So then I gave it a try from the European University Institute, and maybe predictably, I actually found a lot of sources. So it took me a lot of time and also decision what I want to focus on. And it turned out that there was just this whole very diverse history that was forgotten, silenced, purposefully omitted, or very often perceived like something not worth discussing, not worth attention. So this was my starting point, of course. And I focused on the interwar period, but I think every historical period for a researcher, for a historian, you always have some genealogy, and you have everything that comes after. In this case, the Second World War is the time of the Cold War and communism in Eastern Europe. These things are there in this interwar time. And probably very importantly for current political situation is that very often the interwar period as a time of independent Poland is very important political reference, not only for nationalists, but generally for politicians, like the right Poland, like the communist Poland was the Soviet Poland, or Poland that was basically a satellite. Previously, before the First World War, of course, but the partitions, so-called partitions, when Poland did not exist politically. So this is very often the point of reference. And what I do in this research, it was not even an agenda, to kind of show how queer Poland was. The fact is that Poland decriminalized homosexuality in 1932, a year before Denmark, for example. And both countries were pioneers in the 20th century Europe in this regard. I looked at the criminal codes of both countries at that time, and they had basically twin provisions. So Poland was in this, for many people, unexpected and forgotten first wave of decriminalization of homosexuality, of homosexual acts. So I think I sometimes just tell people this fact and observe how they react. And this really changes how people think about queer history in Poland and about Eastern Europe more generally. And as you said, this is much more complex. That I would very often would like to see Eastern Europe as, like backward and lagging behind everything and being just monolithically homophobic. I think my research shows that this is not only much more complex, it's just wrong.
Yeah, yeah, that's but it's also I think we often want to have this linear idea of history and the development of rights as a continuous progressive line, and where this shows it actually it goes up and down and back and forth more or less in this way. And it, as you mentioned, the whole thing of the parallels between Denmark and Poland was at least a surprise to me when I read one of your articles for preparing for this, because this is very much a part of the self understanding of Denmark, of course. Also, the first country where it was legal to get to have a registered partnership in the world. So in that sense, having that and then contrasted with that in 32 and 33 was fascinating.
It is also, maybe it's worth to add that we very often look at queer history or LGBT history in Europe from the perspective of very centralized, like, obviously Berlin. Mm-hmm. And we know how tough it was in the UK or in England and Wales at first. And I think what is interesting is actually sometimes to look from this more traditionally called peripheral places like Denmark, like Poland, Estonia, for example. Also, a lot was done there during the interwar period. Sweden as well, right? So, maybe this research also more generally about Europe, it says that there are different narratives that we can say and stories than those that we've been told so far.
Yeah. And perhaps sometimes, which is probably healthy, slightly some of the things, the boring side, so to speak, of this history, because Berlin, it's with the hedonism, etc., etc. It's a good story. Also, it's very visceral compared to some of the other things that you have described, who are nonetheless interesting, but yeah, perhaps not as visceral a story. But you said, I said in the beginning, that one of your articles, you use this historical perspective to tie and use it to understand the current developments in Polish politics when it comes to LGBTQ plus rights. And we should just say that this, the articles was published before the recent elections in Poland. But could you perhaps explain to us the term homonationalism and how we can use that perhaps to understand some of the current dynamics, both in Central European politics, but also how it might be reflected in other parts of the world?
So, as I always underline that I'm a historian, take a bit of a distance towards that I'm just not a political scientist. But obviously, as I also said before, I deal with things that are extremely important for what is happening now. And also very often they are ideologically used and abused. So homonationalism is not a term that I coined now. It's a term that has a bit of history itself. It was created probably around 15 years ago by American scholar Jasbir Puar, not a historian. And she, simplifying a lot, calls homonationalism a reorientation of nation states and capitalism's relationships to sexuality, what it means in practice. She focused mostly on Israel and Palestine, which is unfortunately, again, a very current topic, but also on the United States and Holland, and showing that she talks about certain collusion of LGBT or queer subjects with nation states' discriminatory policies and rhetoric. In practice, it means that some parties or states or political parties can use LGBT rights as an, let's say, excuse to persecute other groups or target other groups. And of course, it may happen with support of LGBT communities or without their support, as purely exploitation in a way. Usually both things happen. Another term that is quite common in this regard is pinkwashing, right? When we say, okay, we can, for example, curtail rights of a certain group because we want to protect the LGBTQ community's rights. And this not always is really the reality. So she suggests that it is this collusion serves more the state than the LGBT community. Why I started talking about this topic? Because of course, what you said before, there is this maybe tendency or that we all have in organizing things in very clean-cut categories, and especially binary or dichotomous categories. And certain stereotype emerges that, West is homonationalist and broadly speaking, East or not Western countries are homophobic. And here would be certainly not only Russia, but also Poland with its still current government being the most homophobic probably government in Europe at the time. And what I wanted to show with my research, as I mentioned before, about decriminalisation, is that the government very often says LGBT rights are something that is coming from the West, it's imposed, or maybe even whole queer culture or queer cultures are something that comes from the West, so it is alien to us. This is a very important word, us, right, in nationalism, and trying to kind of put everybody in one basket. So it basically, the conclusion or the suggestion of such rhetoric is that if you are gay and you're openly gay or you're queer and you manifest, you're not really so Polish. So what my research says when I write about my dissertation and hopefully soon a book about men cross-dressing in the streets of Warsaw in the interwar period, about homosexual sex workers at the time, about parties where people performed in drag, I showed that this is not true, because this is the Poland they love, right? The interwar Poland that was such a holy symbol for them. So what I want to suggest is that the shift between homophobic state and homonationalist state potentially may be much easier than we imagine, because it is a political will at some point. Also, we saw already with Donald Trump in the US, for example, at some point he, I think, banned American embassies from waving the rainbow flag, like
yes,
using them at the buildings. we are aware of it, that, as you said, history is very often this kind of a sinusoid. We go up and we go down, and very often the rights that we gained can be taken from us. So I think what is my point, there are several points, of course, in this article, is that, for example, the Peace Party now is using this very homophobic rhetoric, but also very anti-Muslim rhetoric. And at some point, they can decide, of some other conservatives, to incorporate also LGBT rights. And the question to the community is, do we want that? And we should also prepare. And because in the history of Poland, if you construct this as a politician for propagandic reasons, you can build both. You can prove how homophobic Poland was as any other country in the past. And there are many Western countries that used to be much more homophobic than Poland. And how, let's say, homophile Poland was in the past. And it's a political choice, you kind of choose what sells. And I think their calculation now is playing the homophobic song resonates better with the sector of society they want to appeal to. But already the polls now show that over 50% of Poles support civil marriage, civil partnerships, and some kind of regulation of LGBT rights. So we are in the particular moment, and also I observed a lot in my life LGBT community that is members that can be very, very nationalist, very xenophobic, and I think we should be aware of it and also have this kind of discussions, not only in Poland, obviously.
Yeah. And one of the things I really liked there was how the PIS party is trying to have this kind of having a bit of having their cake and eating it too, by saying, well, we have nothing against LGBTQ plus persons as long as it's in the right way, in the Polish way. We don't want this hedonistic Western form of LGBTQ plus culture, but the right Polish LGBTQ plus culture is absolutely fine. And I'm quite fascinated with how they're trying, and that probably is something that speaks to that audience that you also just mentioned, that within the LGBTQ plus community, you would of course also have members who are, as you said, xenophobic or in other ways, as we can see, perhaps particularly in the UK and the US, where we have the LGBT without the T movements, where you can see that even within the LGBTQ plus community, there are friction, definitely.
There are a few good points that you mentioned, because very often we just say, as I said before, LGBT, but very often T is already problematic even for the LGBT community, or even LG or G or whatever. There are frictions and divisions, and sometimes, unfortunately, what I also observe in my sources, and I write about it in the interwar period, this is not a new strategy when one group or one sector of this bigger queer community tries to gain something at the expense of the other groups, or a particular part of it. And we should be aware of it, that sometimes some groups can feel tempted to, oh yes, let's get rid of this one group, and our crowd will be more accepted by the mainstream, or whoever, by political decision makers. What you said before is that there is a big controversial context to what you said. There are 2 points. First, I would like to mention that, yes, there is this interview, for example, that Kaczyński, the leader of the of the main conservative party in Poland that has been in power for the last 8 years. He gave this interview to Bild, the German newspaper, when he actually said how homophile Poland used to be. Of course, it was it was an interview for German public, not for Polish public. So he actually said it was you who persecuted homosexuals in the past, not Poland. Poland has never actually had a strictly speaking Polish law criminalizing homosexuality. But also, as my research shows, for example, in the interwar period, Poland was relatively tolerant towards, let's say, sexual descent or diversity. But he would never say. I don't think he would say it in Poland to his public. So here we already can see strategy. He also, I remember, in his previous government, the first time when they were at power, I think in 2005, maybe, I don't remember exactly. He went also to Brussels and he had a conference, and he was saying something very similar to that, like that. He even mentioned that in our government there are homosexuals, and of course, this is a big gossip in Poland. It's been for years that Kaczyński himself is homosexual, right? Everybody knows it. Nobody writes about it. Also, because there is this kind of standard in Poland of not touching private life of politicians, we can discuss it. There is a big discussion actually among LGBT activists that I know. Should we out right-wing queers or not? But this discussion is a fact. I'm not saying Kaczyński is homosexual or gay, but the discussion and saying that he is a fact. Everybody talks about it and knows it. So it was particularly bizarre when I think at the time he was the prime minister, when in Brussels said they are gay people or homosexual in our government. So it was like, do you mean yourself? And there we come back to what you said also in your question, that there is the right Polish way, allegedly, of being gay, and the bad Western or German way of being gay. And the conclusion, we could suppose that what he means, the right way is to hide, be in the closet, or not to speak about it. But actually, what also my research shows is that a lot of public figures in the interwar period were not only openly homosexual, like Karol Szymanowski, the most, after Frédéric Chopin, probably the second most achieved musician in Polish culture. In the 1930s and early 1930s, he worked with a bunch of young fans that he called jeune homme, like beautiful men. And everybody knew that he had relationships with them, and he showed up with them in the box in the opera. He was not hiding it. However, what was different, it was not in our nowadays sense like queer gay community. I think it was much more fluid. He also had relationships with certain kind of relationships with women. We of course very often don't know what was the real nature. But what I want to say, that maybe the real Polish way is just being very bisexual, very open, very fluid, very queer. Because if you remember from the article, this guy who went to Berlin in the interwar period, who was himself homosexual, he said, "Oh, this is so horrible what they do in Berlin, because they made of their sexuality a kind of a union, like very bourgeois style of organizing everything, put in separate drawers, and here are these people, here are these people, here are these people." So his suggestion is that the Polish way is that being as you are, staying relatively open, but not close yourself in separate clubs or bars, but also not being in the closet in our sense, not because this man that I'm talking about, he wrote this in a letter to a newspaper So he kind of openly says, I'm homosexual, but I don't like the way people in Germany are homosexual. Because in Poland, basically, we are more fluid, we just do things and not make of it, an association.
And doesn't make a spectacle. You could perhaps to some extent tie to today's discussions about whether passing for straight is a good thing or not, because it feels perhaps a bit like it's so, well, do you have to make a spectacle of it, or could you just be like everybody else and then just happen to be gay? Or is that am I interpreting there?
I would not, certainly, if Kaczynski is homosexual or is gay, I wouldn't say he's not making a spectacle of it. There are plenty of pictures in the press with his cat when he's very sweet and is playing with the cat, and he tries to be very soft-spoken and use like very upper class language very often when from time to time he comes up with some long forgotten very intellectual word, and then the press is trying to figure out what it is. I mean, I'm not saying Kaczynski is Poland's Oscar Wilde of the 21st century, but he's not a very butch politician, and yes, I mean, this is what the right wing now tries to say, that of course homosexuals are there. This is already a certain move. Now they don't deny it completely. They say, yes, homosexuals are there, probably even in our party, but they are behaving respectively, in a respectable way. I'm sorry. But as I said, like through my research, I try to show that actually if they claim this is the Polish way, the history is contradicting this claim. That the Polish way was for a very long time also containing very sometimes spectacular ways of being queer and very performative ways. Like I have this account of men in drag in the streets of Warsaw, with long hair, beautiful dresses, and newspapers wrote about it. So what I suggest is that this putting gays in the closet, and on the closet it's written Polish culture or Polishness or Poland, is based on a manipulated history. If you want, okay, do that. But if you say this is Polish because Polish history is like this, it's a lie. It's not true.
Yeah, you've really highlighted in the stuff you've talked about the actual complexity of these histories. Like some of the things you've talked about today, and in your papers, I just wasn't aware of, because we're not told those stories, and the projection of the narrative is very selective from different politicians, and not just in Poland, but all over the world. But given that things are complicated, we thought we'd make them a little bit more complicated and start talking about research policy, because that's what everybody thinks about when they think about LGBTQ rights in Europe. And we know you're not a policy geek like ourselves and what many of our listeners are, but you'll probably be aware that there's a new framework discussion just starting to kick off now for the next European research framework. It's currently known as FP10, and one of the things that's quite interesting, both for us but also for the European Commission, is how diversity and internationalisation works within that. The European Commission, for some time now, particularly in Horizon Europe, the most recent program, has really moved the dial on diversity and have sent some very clear signals to people across Europe that they want diversity to be taken seriously in research. This is not just something that's an add-on or something you can choose, but there is an expectation that in the future this will become even more serious, that they really want people to look at things like race and LGBTQ issues over and above gender. But given the complexity in the political environments across Europe, is this Is this feasible? Is this achievable? Given that the member states need to sign it off, we'd love to know your thoughts, even though you're not a political scientist, as you've said.
Yeah. I mean, I would also like to know your thoughts on this. When it comes to the context, the political situation that I follow, I think, of course, with the elections now in Poland, everybody is very hopeful, and I think this is a huge celebration of democracy, and I think it was a great sign or a great great news for not only for Poland, right? Like, because we got an example that a country that has gone quite far in nationalist right-wing policies, to the point when it started to change the political system, can still kind of go back and rebuild or renovate democracy. Of course, we are at the beginning of this road. This is what we hope for. We will observe. So also the hope is that this government will be more inclusive and more accommodating to the needs of such groups as ethnic minorities, race minorities, Russian minorities, LGBTQ community, and so on. What I think about it, I'm a bit pessimistic, but I'm generally pessimistic. I mean, I research 1930s. No?
Well, that probably tells a lot about a person. No.
And of course, as a historian, whenever you see certain political developments, and every day you look at sources, newspapers from your period, you see similarities and so on, and you are always afraid. If you're a historian doing 1930s, you are always afraid of the worst. And we've been all afraid, I think, of this shift towards right, like Brexit, the political change in Italy, Austria, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, the examples are many. And what I think is that we are facing in Poland now probably it will be the most diverse and heterogenic government, right? We have Tusk's party, civic platform, which many people don't remember it, but it is a party that comes from the same root that peace comes from. I mean, 15 years ago or something, I don't remember exactly, Poles were promised so-called peace government, a civic platform and peace together. And that seemed a very convincing perspective. And it just didn't happen, mostly because of personal animosities between the leaders. But it is a conservative government. It is a conservative party. And then on the other hand, as the weakest partner in this coalition, we have the left. So how it's going to work, we will obviously see. What I think is that this government will not certainly block things, as not in the sense as peace did. And I don't think playing homophobic card, they understand that would not serve them. However, there are many homophobes in the winning parties, and some of them have already expressed their they've already actually promised they will not vote for expansion of LGBT rights. Expansion, they don't exist really in Poland, so it's not even an emergence somehow. So, however, they are pro-European generally, and that's the main difference with peace. And what I think is they will not block this kind of low-level positive changes when it comes to diversity and minority rights. And it is because they are not very attractive to the public, they are not very flashy, but I think they will have enormous impact on academic life, and on right to research, because as I said at the beginning, I couldn't start such research in Poland, or I was discouraged to do so because of lack of funding and so on. And I already hear that there is more going on in Poland now in LGBT studies, much more than it was several years ago. And it's partially because more and more people in the academia in Poland see that these are real fields and things have to be done there. And then suddenly there are people doing some research even in Poland, somehow still under this right-wing government. So I suppose this should get better in next years. At least when it comes to Poland. I don't know about other countries. We all hope that Hungary will be a bit separated, right? A bit kind of insulated and maybe marginalized. We know that Latvia has recently changed the law, so when it comes to civil partnerships, I believe. So I think things are changing for better. And I think very often what is crucial is that it is kind of low profile, something that does not excite so much the public or is not easy to exploit by populist politicians to mobilize certain, usually relatively small sectors of society. No?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's
I'm sorry.
No.
Very long.
No, that's fine. I think it was quite a positive response from a pessimistic when you started out so pessimistically. I think I'm inclined to agree. I expect that most of this will get signed off and will be approved. I think where there may be challenges is when you have countries, as you mentioned, like Hungary, who might then push back internally within their own country. And the question will then be, is the European Commission going to be able to get them to change their ways, to impose sanctions, whatever it might be? But on the whole, I'm relatively positive about it.
But if I may add one thing, we should remember that Hungary, for example, still has civil partnerships, right?
Yeah.
Hungary still provides LGBT community with certain basic rights, and Poland is still behind. And this government, in this coalition agreement that they presented a few days ago, there was not a mention of LGBT community. So, I think Tusk also does a good job of presenting himself as this pro-European hope abroad. But I think a lot of people in Poland understand that he's still a conservative politician. I think many of us hope that by traveling to Brussels, it is not that he got civilized or Europeanized. It's that he maybe saw a bit more, diversity of society, maybe so that the society doesn't crumble once people have rights or some groups have rights. That he maybe realized that actually the strength of society is very often in its diversity. So, it's not about saying that, I don't know, he got Europeanized, like that he just saw something more than Warsaw and Gdańsk, where he's from now. It's the hope.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that perhaps, because I was a bit worried about because the European Commission has appeared very progressive about how to include, as Lachlan said, a diversity of perspective into research and also research groups. And I was a bit worried about how that would be. Yeah, as we said, would that even be feasible to be voted through? But reading your articles and having this whole idea about the message outwards and the message inwards for a country, I'm perhaps more positive. That also because science policy or politics isn't a bestseller, isn't it? And there's no country where that's nobody wins an election or loses an election on research policy, do they? So in that sense, it could probably fly under the radar, and you could, you could present inwardly to the country as conservative and fighting against LGBTQ plus rights, but try and present a positive picture towards the rest of Europe by signing off on all these things and allowing these things to develop in the fashion you the rest of the union wants to. So in that sense, perhaps these nuances about what actually is talked about within the country and outside the country, and the complexity of a history is perhaps actually the way to understand why this could actually happen with less problems that I was concerned it would a week ago before reading all your material.
I think there are 2 points that I wanted to add. First of all, I think a lot of politicians still try to follow this strategy of saying something inside the country and something outside. And I think the time is coming for them to realize that the world doesn't work like this anymore. There are so many there are millions of Polish citizens already living abroad, myself including. There is an increasing number of Polish speakers. People learn the language. There are people interested in the language and the culture. There are services, like DeepL and Google Translate. We are not and even, this is very difficult, probably difficult. It is different to understand for people who come from cultures like English culture or German culture, when you have a lot of worldwide speakers of these languages. But I understand, as you, Jakob, you come from Denmark, you know this kind of this situation of being closed in certain language when other people don't have access. And I think this is luckily finishing. And I think it would be good for these politicians also to understand that this doesn't work anymore. And I think last year they also very often realized that one way they were speaking in Poland about very fast was heard in Brussels, for example, or somewhere else. And they were immediately caught on doing this when they thought they would be, that punishment, nobody would never know what they said and they could say something else there. So this is one thing. And the second thing that I wanted to mention is that they have conflicted agenda. Because what I observed from being here for years in the European University, at the European University Institute, is that Poland and Polish governments, regardless of their provenance, if they are more central, this right wing, they all want, obviously, as any other government, that Polish science or Polish academics are noticed abroad and that they are successful. And for example, Polish government is really always very strongly trying to lobby for more Polish academics at the EUI, at this institute in Florence, for those that don't know what it is. And I heard from some professors there that Poland really tries to be so present. But at that time, the EUI, as an academic institution that tries to keep certain level, wants to attract academics that are doing cutting-edge research, that academics that are changing and are innovative. So the problem is that once you want to be noticed and you want to be successful in terms of knowledge and science, you cannot you cannot reject the change, how the fields are changing, and it's not only history, but it's political science, everything. So I think very often they don't really know how to deal with it. And sometimes I think they tolerate certain research that maybe if it came publicly known, they wouldn't support, but kind of lower level, they can always come up, this researcher got Fulbright, this researcher got very good position somewhere, and we funded their education, and this is thanks to our government. So this is another thing, as you said, like maybe luckily, or in some cases not so luckily, very often research policies are not very diligently followed by the public.
No, and for better and worse, you said there could be pros and cons in all of this. Finally, because we have been talking a lot, and that's what happens when it's things are interesting. But when finally, we have discussed a lot of this as politics and rules so far. But you and we, of course, do this work because we have skin in the game as openly gay men, and I think it's important that we remember that this isn't all rules and policy, but it's about the lives of real people. So could you perhaps finish the conversation by telling the listeners a little about Stefan and Marjan, whom you write about in your Call Me By Your Name article?
So I think this is actually probably a good closure, because we come really to the core of my research, what I do, where I come from. Stefan and Marian was a homosexual couple that lived in a borderland, Poland and Lithuania, in the early 1920s. And if you want to know more how they met, there was quite a romantic meeting on a train going somewhere, very long trip through eastern Poland, and how they organized their lives in this countryside, in the very rural area, around Suwałki, which is the coldest place in Poland nowadays, and very, very rural, but also very diverse in terms of ethnicity and religious and regions at the time. But what is important in these three stories? There are several takeaways. One of them is that I prove or demonstrate, thanks to the letters that they left and I found with a friend of mine, Wojtek Szot, I demonstrating the letters that they actually had kind of a secret marriage, homosexual secret marriage, and that's first such marriage documented in Polish history, as far as I know. And it was very similar actually to heterosexual marriage. There was an oath, there was a promise of staying forever together, supporting each other, not betraying each other. And if you think about, a lot of people can say, okay, but this is secret, this doesn't matter because the state was not involved. But until very, very late, Catholic Church, for example, didn't expect from people to do public oath. If a couple promised to each other something before God, even if they were in private, that was valid. And this happened very often in the past. Secondly, they are particular because also they are very different men. And one of them has completely impressive self-knowledge. And he had actually kind of subjectivity or identity, as some would say, of a homosexual man that we know from our times. He was convinced he's different than other people. But what is even more impressive is that he told to a cousin of his partner that he believes that one day men will be allowed to live together and it will be commonly accepted. So in I think 1923, which was long before even Poland decriminalized homosexual act. So this is very, very, very important. And of course comes the ideas, the thoughts, where did he have these ideas from? Like, is it a work of his, his personal work, like coming to the thought that there is nothing wrong about me? This is something very difficult to achieve for many people nowadays. And that's what he claimed. However, the other guy when they stood the trial, he had a very different perception of himself. He would say today he was more bisexual. And he said that he didn't know what homosexuality was. And for us, it may seem strange, but at that time, this was an idea. The concept of calling someone a homosexual was something quite new. And, it's maybe difficult to imagine, but, nowadays there are some people that are confused by terms like transsexual, transgender, and so on. They don't know what it means. And that time, homosexuality or homosexual was a similar term, like some people just didn't know what it was. So it also shows that that in this rural area, some people sometimes could have sex with the same sex and didn't think about it as something, defining for their identity. Because nowadays, of course, once we have sex with the same sex, with a person of the same sex, we think, oh my God, maybe I'm homosexual, maybe I'm bisexual, etc. We have these questions. But this is a very modern concept of identity, right? And the guy, the other guy that I'm talking about now, he said to the court that, we had sex because I thought there were no women in the village available, and it was pleasant. And that was his perception. And so it shows us how homosexuality, or these categories that are so important for us nowadays, were appearing at some time, and what maybe this article allows us to look a bit how it was before. And then it turns out that these categories of, fluidity, queerness, and so on are maybe not so extremely modern and new, or maybe they are even older than our category of homosexual. And yes, and maybe the last point, to come back to Poland and all this nationalism and national nation state, is that actually these two men were not from this place that I mentioned, not from this borderlands of They arrived there because the Polish state, Poland, needed Polish speakers in an area that was ethnically, linguistically very diverse and heterogeneous. So basically, it was the Polish state that created the opportunity for them to have this secret marriage, which of course was not the goal of the Polish state. And then the Polish state prosecuted them, prosecuted them, and persecuted through the trial. But it also created certain opportunities for them. And as I write in my dissertation, not only for them, sometimes nationalism could be, or nation state could be helpful in created certain opportunities for same-sex loving people to somehow adapt. But as you mentioned, we also know so many cases of nationalist LGBT people and so on.
Sure. But it's just, I think it was, of course, an interesting article, but also just to show that it has a human face, like it has today, it had back then as well. It isn't always this abstract discussion about rights, but that actually sometimes we are actually talking about the lives of real human beings. And I think that's just as important to remember when we are designing these things in research policy, and we have these ideas about gender analysis or diversity analysis in the research, and the concept we have about the research community. It easily becomes this, now they're requiring this other thing of us. And it's like, yes, because it's actually our lives. And the moment it becomes these concepts. And another annoying thing to do with the research is like, you just remember you're talking about my life.
I'm very happy you made this point, because what I found so precious in this case, in these two stories, is that they show us so much, they give us so much insight to the letters in this individual way that hopefully everybody, but usually queer or gay people, go through, of kind of trying to self-understand who I am vis-a-vis the society, vis-a-vis myself, vis-a-vis my partner, and the people I love. And that, of course, we live in some state-organized reality, but this journey is a very individual experience, and it is usually crucial for who we think we are.
Mm-hmm. I think that is a wonderful note to end this on, and leave for the people working with FP10 to how they will include that policy wise, and to make research better. And good luck to those who are going to know and negotiate all of this with the Polish and Hungarian governments when it comes to that. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for sharing your research with us. And we will, of course, link to the articles in the show note. But thank you for sharing this, and thank you for speculating with us on how this is going to play out.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
And that was our conversation with Kamil. So, Lachlan, what were your takeaway points from the conversation?
You know what? Sometimes you go into conversations, don't you, and you have no idea in which direction they're going to go, and and what you might learn. And honestly, that was fascinating. I mean, there was so much information in there around the history of, well, queer history in Poland, which I just wasn't aware of. And you know, I think it highlighted for me a little bit of that, you know, for a lot of us in Europe, if you're in Western Europe, our understandings of some of these histories, particularly queer histories, but other histories as well in parts of Eastern Europe are probably nowhere near as sophisticated as they should be. Like we've got some knowledge gaps there. But the thing that really sort of stood out for me was the fact that this is so nuanced that, you know, we tend to make blanket stereotypes or decisions about countries and the way we think they operate. And, you know, you might think of a country like Poland or like Hungary, and they're the two that we probably talk the most about in the podcast, as being very black and white on LGBTQ issues, when the reality is these things are much more nuanced. The history is much more nuanced. It's much more complicated. The way governments and the way institutions present themselves both externally to outside nations or institutions, but also internally within their own country, can be quite different. And I think the thing that struck me around all of that is that when we try and bring that forward to where we are today, and when we're starting to look at questions of diversity and internationalisation, and particularly within Framework 10, but more broadly as well, is that it actually gave me a bit more hope than I had before, which was really encouraging, because I wasn't expecting that as part of the conversation, if I'm honest.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting in that historical perspective when we work with these things, we often talk about identity, and in this historical perspective, when also with the last history he told us about that couple, is how identities, and now we're talking about queer identities, but it could be all sorts of minority groups and the identity around that, how it is developed and how it changes, and how sometimes it is developed because someone envisions it to be different at a certain time in history, and it can go back and forth when it comes to rights as well. And I think that's an important perspective when we are working in research projects, that we have this perspective on identities and the development of identities, and how the whole complexity of the situation within a country. And when we talk about LGBTQ plus identities and rights, that just because it doesn't match the way we think about it and talk about it, doesn't mean it isn't there. It might just look different. That's not to say that we should fight for things to look different, and I'm not excusing anyone here, letting people get away with murder, but I'm just saying it's just that we perhaps sometimes over interpret some things because we don't see it in the right cultural light, and that is true for us as well. We have been banging on about Poland and Hungary here on the podcast for several times. So in that sense, there's something to learn for us as well. And also with the concept of homonationalism, how complex it is also within the LGBTQ plus community, and how we can link that to political environments, and how sometimes we also have to look within the communities, and how everybody else can't take for granted that this is an open community that stands with everybody else, etc., etc. We talked about that as well before. So this just to say that we learn a lot, but it also gives us a muddy picture. And as well as you, I was a lot more hopeful after the conversation than before. But it's also just to say that it might be easier to get some things through the member states in Central and Eastern Europe than we thought. But it's also a very complex picture, how we get to do that. But it's also a complex to consider, how do we do this within, in this case, the LGBTQ plus community. But the same could be said if it goes up to, if we talk about gender, and we talk about race, and if we talk about all sorts of things, the perspectives within that minority group will differ significantly. And I hope that this whole discussion about history and the term homonationalism has really helped people think about these topics. And as we move on towards developing, FP10, and how will this look in these areas, that we have to look at this complexity. Even if we have a very clear ideal, then perhaps we need a level of pragmatism in how we get there.
And if you've ever been to any of our training sessions, you will have heard us talk about the fact that you need to turn off your cultural autopilots, and you need to go into it with an open mind. And I do admit in the training sessions, so I don't feel like I'm being disingenuous here, but I do admit in those sessions that sometimes it's hard to do, and I'm not perfect at it. I'm not sure anybody is, but this conversation we've just had with Kamil has highlighted. Well, obviously you are. Yes, obviously you are. But this highlighted for me the fact that you've really got to go in with an open mind. So when you're having these negotiations with your Eastern European partners or whoever they might be, really go in with an open mind here, because you're probably going to be surprised, and there'll be more in common, I think, than you imagine as well.
And you will find that you have allies in the sometimes the most unsuspected places, but also that you will have people who you thought would be allies who turns out not to be. So, and this, of course, I think it's just going to be a very interesting conversation about FP10, but also I think this from the outset, talking to a historian about the LGBTQ rights in the interwar period can perhaps seem a bit odd, but I do think that it on so many levels have given at least us some food for thought, both on policy sides, but also talking, as I said, on identity and stuff that we can use both in our consultancy and in other work. And I really, really hope that people have given this a good listen and will work with it. We will link to the articles in the show notes. They are open access, and having read them, they are incredibly interesting, and some it showcases both some good vocabulary to think and work with, but also some brilliant stories to read. So, do you have any more to add?
No, I think that sums it up brilliantly. I really would encourage people to go away and read the articles and have a think about the sort of concepts, and also just have a think about, or be reminded, I guess, that history is so important, and learning from history and understanding history to help us with the future.
And we will, of course, in the coming seasons, talk more about FP10, how it's going to look, how we do this.
Yeah.
So if you have any ideas and suggestions for guests or topics to cover, but of course in general, but particularly linked to that, feel free to reach out to us, and we will try to incorporate it the best way we can. But yeah, I think that was it for now. But we'll be back in a couple of weeks, and so talk to you then.